Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's installment of the Slavery Archive Book Club. My name is Vanessa Holden. I'm joined today by co-convener and co-founder Ana Lucia Arroyo. We also have on our team the other co-founder, Jessica Marie Johnson, and Alex Hill. Tonight, we'll be discussing Robin Chapdelaine's wonderful new book, The Persistence of Slavery, An Economic History of Child Trafficking in Nigeria. Before we get started with Dr. Chapdelaine tonight, a few quick things. First, we will have a question and answer portion of tonight, and it's usually pretty robust. So all that I ask is if you're meeting with us here on Zoom tonight, to go down to the little reactions button with the little smiley face and raise your hand so I can put you in the queue to ask questions when Dr. Chapdelaine finishes with her opening presentation. You can also type out your questions in the chat. And we do typically ask questioners to read their question aloud. If you can, come on camera. And if you can't come on camera, but you can read, you can just use audio. And if neither of those are available to you, I'm able to read your question out loud. So folks joining on YouTube can also hear it. Let me take a second to introduce Dr. Chapdelaine to all of you tonight. Dr. Robin Chapdelaine is an assistant professor of women's and gender and African history at Duquesne University. Her research and teaching focuses on gender, human trafficking, and child labor. In addition to her new book, The Persistence of Slavery, An Economic History of Child Trafficking in Nigeria, she has published articles in African Economic History, Journal of West African History, and Bulletin and Ecumenical Theory. She has published a chapter in the edited volume, Children on the Move in Africa, Past and Present Experiences of Migration, and has forthcoming chapters in Human Trafficking, Global History and Global Perspectives, and Bloomsbury's A Cultural History of Slavery and Human Trafficking. And as if that was not enough, is she out here giving you all this work? She is also working on a co-edited volume about Black women in higher education. Whew. And is currently writing an undergraduate textbook on human trafficking for Rutledge. So Dr. Chapdelaine is out here serving up this wonderful work. So check out her many, many contributions to the field. And with that, Robin, why don't you go ahead and share your screen, and I invite you to start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you to all of the organizers of this amazing space where we can share not only our work, but we get to know each other by face a little bit. We get to engage in active intellectual conversations. So I do want to extend my appreciation. And thank you, everybody who has joined me this evening to talk about my work. The region that I focus on is in southeastern Nigeria. In particular, I am looking at the Owerri, Calabar, Onitsha, and Agoja provinces of southeastern Nigeria during the 1920s and 30s. The book does start in an earlier period, the late 19th century, and has information up to current day with regards to child trafficking in Nigeria. But my case studies, my interviews in relation to what individuals remember their families telling them about, what the archival material shows me, comes mainly from the 20s and the 30s. So this evening, I'm going to talk about the inspiration for the book. I will give a short overview of the sources that I used. I will give an overview of the chapters, and then of course, Q&A. So what interested me in researching child trafficking during, as a source, as a moment that spurred my interest in writing this book. And it was reading Judith Van Allen, Sitting on a Man, during graduate school. I found that it was really interesting. Obviously, a lot of people had written about it. Anthropologists, the 1929 Women's Uprising, anthropologists had written about it. Historians, dance historians, political scientists. It had received so much academic attention. I thought, well, let me go ahead and look at the testimony of this, the Women's War. And the women that talked about it, the individuals that were there, both British and African. I wanted to understand what exactly happened. And in the aftermath of this Women's War, which I'll discuss a little bit later in the talk, they scheduled this commission of inquiry during 1930, and they called witnesses. And that was the testimony that I reviewed. And that testimony itself was specifically the inspiration. This was a global, this received global attention. The New York Times were publishing about the uprising. European newspapers were publishing about the uprising. So in no way was this something that happened in Nigeria in kind of an insular bubble. It definitely demanded international attention. So besides the testimony, I had to commission oral testimonies. I've been to Nigeria a few times now, but the time that I went to conduct my interviews was the same year that President Goodluck Jonathan decided to rescind the oil subsidies. So I ended up having to leave on a moment's notice because everybody was in an uprising literally about this particular moment in his presidency. And Rutgers called me home. They said I had to get on the next plane out. So now that that funding was lost, I had to utilize local researchers to conduct the interviews on my behalf. And luckily, each one of them sent back not just the audio tapes, most of them were English, but if they were not in English, they transcribed them. And then a good number of them also had not just audio, but videos as well. And I used mainly Nigerian newspapers, some US, some British, and then colonial documents, financial records, court cases, prison records, and international correspondence. And then of course, anthropological accounts before, during, and after the Women's War. The book is separated into 5 parts. It has 5 main chapters, but as I mentioned earlier, the conclusion kind of brings the history of child trafficking to the contemporary moment. We have chapters that are based on both early historical periods and the discussion of, where I start with the discussion of early pawning and what that meant in terms of social relations, money lending, access to credit. I talk about how some of these colonial policies changed those relationships. Also what was happening internationally with regards to the welfare of children. At the same moment where we have the uprising of the women who are also responding to economic concerns during this interwar period. And then of course, the 1930s presents its own issues in chapter 5 with regards to the number of investigations that the British demanded upon the district officers, and I talk about the outcomes of that. Okay, so here I'll just briefly go over some of the main points of each of the chapters. I situate chapter 1 in a way that recognizes that this increase of domestic slavery, as opposed to the transatlantic slave trade, is on the rise, especially because of the increase in cash crop production, where, understanding that it becomes a moment of normalizing child trafficking, pawning, stealing, child slavery. And of course, children who were sold or enslaved could share similar attributes to those children who were pawned, but they were not mutually, or rather, they're not the exact same thing. There's some porosity, but there are distinct differences in terms of rights when it comes to which institution the child inhabited. There's an anthropological overview of the region. And this is really important because it talks about the kind of trade, the geography, who's trading with whom, what items are of importance. But of course, there's also a discussion of the Aro, who are generally argued by Adele Figbo, Ugo Nokeji as some of the largest slave traders of the transatlantic slave trade. And I talk about their integral part in the continuing domestic trade of children. And then what really becomes important during this time, the end of the 19th, early 20th century, is power relations that were formerly built upon gerontocracies begin to break down because young men have more and more access to wealth. They can start buying titles, which gave them social prominence within their societies, which really decentered the both democratic forms of governance and the importance of having senior men and women in positions of power. And then, of course, there is the canoe house systems, right? The trading centers that are along the ports, and most important in my work are the Bonny and Calabar trading houses. And what the British does with those houses in terms of keeping certain types of slavery legal through legislation. So on the one hand, they've shown this outward commitment to end the slave trade, especially over international waters. But as it relates to the working of the internal economy, they legislated this one particular law, Native House Rule, which dictated that anybody who was already in these houses had to remain in these houses. And should they try to escape from these houses, they could be punished in quite a number of ways. They were not supposed to add additional slaves after 1901. However, any children that they had, if they wanted to be freed, the children would have to pay back all of the money that it took to care for them in the first place. So you could imagine that it was very difficult to become free once you're in this house. Now, that being said, the houses were a place where slaves could acquire wealth in slaves of their own. So it almost requires to a certain extent a different way that we define slavery, that we can imagine slavery compared to chattel slavery in the US. It's just not quite the same. Like I said, you could actually acquire wealth and slaves of your own in this canoe house, even while being a slave. Chapter 2 is a really important chapter as it relates to understanding why people were borrowing money at the rate that they were. In 1914, we have a formalization of the specific areas, the provinces that I'm focused on. And within each of those provinces, we have kind of a reconfiguration of the court system. So they take all of the district officers, which would be the British district officers, out of the local courts, and they put in the warrant chiefs, where the warrant chiefs weren't often from the areas that they ruled over. It is alleged that a lot of them were former criminals. And so you have this new mashup of individuals that are in charge of particular regions that they didn't really have a personal connection to. So with decreased oversight from the British, an influx of individuals who are not from the local regions, in addition to a power dynamic that develops, you begin to see some of the unrest that would eventually lead to the 1929 Women's War. The warrant chiefs were often illiterate, but they depended on educated court messengers and interpreters and letter writers within the native courts to document the outcomes of court cases, to document who paid what fines, to send letters of those who were involved in various court cases, which really shifted the power dynamic of the courts. So in essence, letter writers and interpreters might even be more powerful than the warrant chiefs themselves, because they were actually able to write down a judgment, and it would not necessarily be approved by the warrant chief because he couldn't read. Or not all of them, but most of them couldn't read. So they couldn't do much to overturn what the more literate members of the court did. In this way, court messengers and interpreters could be bribed during these court hearings, and they would abuse their constituents whenever they came to court. And the warrant chiefs understood that they were at a disadvantage. And so the warrant chiefs then, it was almost like a cycle. The warrant chiefs would then increase the fines and bribes on their own, in whatever way they could when it came to the constituents of the courts. And so unfortunately, it was the local populations that really suffered because of this reconfiguration of the court system. And all while this is happening, you have a money lending bill, that's shaped after a 19th century bill from Britain, but then also kind of shaped from what was implemented in Lagos at the time. And it discussed all the ways in which people could borrow money. And people were borrowing money because of these court cases. They were racking up debt because of various fines that they were getting from the native courts. And I mean, whether it was a divorce or a land issue, or you borrowed money to get your crops in one year, there was just a number of reasons why people were borrowing money. But the pawnbrokers bill, while it addressed who could be a money lender in terms of what you needed, you needed to have a structure, you needed to have a sign. There were limitations on the interest that you could charge. There was limitations on how long you can leave something, whether it was money in pawn, or it was an animal in pawn, or land in pawn. There was all of these regulatory things that went into this bill, but there was no mention of human pawns, which on the one hand, the British were talking about it, they're discussing it, they're conversing about it in all of their letters back and forth. And they're talking about, well, it's really important that these pawns are not technically slaves or whatnot, but they just omitted it, or they omitted it from the pawnbrokers bill. And I argue that they did so because they knew if they began to regulate human pawning relationships, they would then limit the amount of money they could exact from the local population as it related to taxation eventually. And so I think in a lot of African histories, especially West African histories that I'm more familiar with, we see that there's a lot of colonial action that's taken that both buttresses the colonial economy, while at the same time kind of purporting human rights, anti-child labor, anti-slavery rhetoric. But of course, we understand that both could not happen in any kind of meaningful way when the colonial economy needed to remain buttressed. Another important part of chapter 2 is I talk about the influx of British silver into the Nigerian local economies. And this kind of backfired, and Ben Nanan has done a lot of good work on this. When the British introduced silver into the local economy, they began to pay Nigerians in this silver coin. But when Nigerians wanted to do anything with the money, like go to the local markets, buy goods, exchange trade items, or want to exchange money for particular different types of trade items, the local people at the markets did not want British silver. So it ended up, while the British was trying to get all the native currency, the indigenous currency, Manila's especially, out of circulation, its value went up because it was scarce. So now you have Nigerians who have to go to money changers to change their British silver coin to Manilas, but with every exchange, they're losing money. So you have an increase of debts for a number of reasons, a loss of real income because of the exchange rates, the onset of the eventual taxation of males, and they're really put in a tough spot when it comes to debt and money lending. Their options were becoming more and more limited, whereas before they would go to the more senior men for loans. Now they were looking for people who were more readily available to access the cash that they needed. And so one of the things that I looked at were the kinds of cases that came to court. And of course, there is this one list of other cases that maybe it just wasn't identified in a particular kind of way. These could have been anything really. But the significant piece of information on this chart really is debts and other contracts, which often had to do with money and money lending. And for each of these different regions, you see, besides this other cases section, that debts and other contracts really were the most litigated issues of 1921. So it begins a trajectory of recognizing, hey, something's happening here. And as I was reading through some of the court cases, more often than not, these debtors would prefer to go to jail than try to borrow any more money, right? They had either pawned what dependent children they had already, they had pawned a piece of land, they had pawned a younger brother or sister. They were running out of resources. So in some cases, they were able to get rid of their debt, so to speak, by going to jail, or at least going to jail to not accumulate more fines and penalties for non-payment. So while Nigerians are dealing with this issue of income, currency exchange, increase in debt, we have the international community that's highly engaged in what's going on through various parts of the colonies, whether it's India, parts of China, Africa itself, Latin America. There's this new movement to pay attention to what children are doing. And this is happening in the US as well with regards to children who are working. And then of course, when we think about the years leading up to this and shortly thereafter with regards to what's happening in the Industrial Revolution and then the decades beyond that. So you have all of these committees being formed, mainly stemming from the League of Nations. You have the Declarations of the Rights of the Child formed. And then, of course, this reexamination in 1925 and 1926 with regards to the Temporary Slavery Commission to identify ways to end the traffic in domestic slaves. So that is when one of the first questionnaires that go out, distributed by the district officers at each of the provinces, and they're asking about pawning, they're asking about child marriage, how old are the pawns, are they boys or girls, how long do they stay with the new guardians, do they ever return, is it akin to slavery? And so there are a lot of district officers that say it absolutely doesn't exist here. This practice ended long ago, et cetera, et cetera. And then with specific regard to early betrothal or child marriage, there were racist comments like, oh, you know, they're promiscuous, they get married at a young age, they're lent out, and then they come back and then they go with another man. But colonial administrators didn't understand the complexity of arranging marriages, that a child could get betrothed while they were young. In a lot of communities, the woman could have the ultimate choice when she was older to marry or not actually marry the man. But yes, instances of pawning could lead to marriage of the young girl if she was pawned, if the debt was not repaid. So that in essence, the money pawned would be accepted as a bride price payment. But this did not always happen. And the other comment by administrators was that colonial officials believed truly that it didn't matter who Nigerians pawned their children to, but actually is quite the opposite. They cared very much about who received the child. If you were from particular slave lineages, like the Osu, they absolutely would not want their children married to an individual with that kind of heritage, rightly or wrongly. It wouldn't be acceptable. So of course, with some of these assumptions, colonial administrators aren't really getting to the heart, the complexity, the importance of these choices. But when these families are in crisis, sometimes when they lent out their children as pawns, when the children were eventually sold directly into slavery, there was no control of that. So this previously, a safe way to gain access to funds and resources by temporarily giving your child at, it was during this period that children began being trafficked and stolen and sold beyond the reach of their families. And I talked about the importance of it being the interwar period, and then of course the transition to legitimate commerce and the kind of increased labor needs that Africa, that Nigeria, and well, really a lot of parts of Africa demanded. So what was the main focus of my book, and to a certain extent, it really is still the main focus, but I limited the Women's War analysis to one chapter. There's been so much written about the Women's War. It's still being written about. The Journal of West African History just had an entire issue. I say just, but I think it was in 2017, really still talking about the importance of this research and this event, this women's uprising. So I go through and I talk about the Women's War and why women, got so angry that day when a school teacher went around trying to enumerate all the families and all of the animals belonging to each family. And just a fast recap, in doing so, he really angered one of the local women. It was really, he was trying to count her children, and it's really bad luck to enumerate children in that way. It was very disrespectful. And then all chaos ensued with regards to the women who found out about this, and they decided, and they were fearful that they were trying to count them so that the taxes already applied to men and exacted for men would then be exacted to women. And so this uprising of thousands who traveled hundreds of miles ended in hundreds of deaths, pardon me, ensued. And so when they came together in 1930 for this inquiry testimony, and as I examined the testimony, all of the literature that's been written talked about women were frustrated. They were market women. They were suffering from increased import taxes, decreased export taxes. They were highly involved in the palm oil trade. They were frustrated about their position in society kind of being subordinated with the onset of some of the British that came and putting the control over their market in the hands of men. It really did disenfranchise women to a large extent. But what I found was what they were really testifying about was the fact that they were pawning their children to pay colonial taxes, but they weren't getting the chance to get them back, right? So when you pawn someone, the labor that individual provides, it pays the interest on the loan, but you still have to pay the loan. Sometimes a child could be in pawn for up to 10 years, as both colonial documents and some of the interviewees explained. But they are selling them to willing money, selling the money lenders are selling them to willing child dealers. And it becomes really obvious that the old roots of the Arrow slave trade are still locations of main markets where these children are being exchanged, where information is passed off from one to another about the need for particular kinds of children versus who's available, right? They'd be kind of housed and hidden at local homes around these markets. And that had to do with, in part, sometimes the palm oil plantations and the labor that's needed, and other types of agricultural efforts, in addition to perhaps religious slash, for lack of a better term right now, fetish efforts, right? Religious importance. But then also there was a great effort to remove the child in a way that they could not find their way home. So sometimes they would seclude the children for quite a number of months until the child learned the local language. They wouldn't be able to get home. They couldn't say where they were from if there was an investigation. And in time, they would become acclimated to their environment. So you can see some of these quotes here. There was a whole bunch of things that were happening with regards to accessing and taking children away from their homes. I must say that this last quote was not from the Women's War. It was a direct quote from one of my interviewees. And so even there's a family memory there about the way in which children were pawned to pay taxes. Okay. So 1920s, nothing decreases in terms of child trafficking. The 1930s, with all of the additional efforts by the League of Women and their international efforts and their demanding and their letter writing and their showing up in the various ways that they do to make the colonial entity in Nigeria end child trafficking. What ends up happening is that the British commissioner, the British administrators say there's really nothing we can do. Some say that, and then others say, oh no, it really doesn't exist. But truly at the end, by the end of the chapter, I show that really what they decide to focus on is to deal with the welfare of those children who were previously enslaved. So a lot of rehabilitation centers, technical schools, educational efforts, kind of social reform efforts for sure, but there's not a huge effort that comes again in terms of ending the trade in children. So what am I actually arguing? I'm arguing that my book offers the framework to understand a child's economic positionality in society, which I call the social economy of a child. It is an ideology that asserts that children are valued as kin, laborers, and are protected as dependents, yet also used as collateral in a variety of ways when parents or guardians suffer from economic insolvency. Children are economic vehicles through which wealth is transferred. That isn't to say that they weren't loved or cared for. It was precisely because they were cared for that we knew the parents would have gone to redeem them, that the moneylender knew that he or she would be repaid. However, the breakdown during the interwar period, and especially during the 20s and 30s, show that the economic state of the country was such that it was more profitable to sell the child off for money than it was to hold the child in pawn until the parents repaid their debts. So with that, I will go ahead and entertain questions.
Thanks so much. All right, everyone. So feel free to raise your hand or type into the chat, and you can also ask your question aloud. Oh, looks like we're already getting a queue together. Elizabeth, would you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
Certainly. Thank you very much. This was wonderful. I really, really enjoyed this talk. My own work is in Ondo's side of the nation, so I'm learning more about the Eastern side, but I've also read a lot about the Women's War. So I just like to ask two things. One is, Jane Geyer has talked about the wealth in people system. And the cultural logic. And I was wondering if there's a distinction between what she's saying and what you're saying, or whether you fit well together.
I think that we really do fit well together, but I do think that there's something in particular about a re-examination of the Women's War itself that's significant. And that's where my intervention is, besides really doing the only history of children in the Southeast, a comprehensive history, but definitely more complementary than divergent.
That was really helpful. I mean, the idea of the war erupting partly because of the stolen children hadn't occurred to me, and it's really great to hear that. I had another smaller question. When you were talking about pawning children far away in a way that they wouldn't be able to find their way home, that kind of surprised me again. So I'm wondering if where the line between enslavement and pawning is drawn in that case. Because I think of pawning as more building a relationship situation rather than a cut ties kind of situation.
Right. Pardon me, I may have been trying to cover too much too fast. So on the one hand, earlier systems before the 1920s and 30s, you generally pawned to someone that you did know very well, that you would trust, that you understood they would treat your child well. There were instances during this period that you might intentionally pawn a child away to a family member who lived a little further, because kids would run back home and they didn't always want these children running back home. And so they, depending on who the recipient was, a larger geographical space was much appreciated. But what I think that I was speaking too quickly about was that when you went from your interpersonal relationship that was supposed to secure the child to a money lender now, because perhaps now these other people around you didn't have funds, they would make sure that they sold the child far away.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next up I have Abby.
Hi, my name is Abby Warchel. I'm a PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill. And thank you so much for the talk and the work that you've done on this subject. I'm working on children, a project on children in the same period of time in the context of French West Africa. So I have a conceptual question for you. And I wondered if you could speak more about the use of children as a vehicle of analysis here. You talk in the introduction about sort of the history of the term childhood and the cultural specificity of children and, you know, quantities of age here. So I'm just curious about how you found that you're able to think conceptually about the social economy of a child in ways that account for other factors of economic and social vulnerability and value as well. So here I'm specifically thinking about more gendered terms around girlhood and boyhood. And obviously we've seen that great work done by Abasede George around girlhood during this time. So is the use of children here, is that a reflection of sort of the international context and interest in child welfare, as you just talked about? You know, is it about the policies and practices of the British around pawning, or is it really just in the practices of pawning as sort of a method of economic well-being here? So I just wondered if you could say more about that.
So while I was writing my dissertation advisor kept saying, "Robin, you're writing an economic history." I said, "No, I'm not, because I don't like economics. I don't like economic history." And to me, all of that just seemed so like, God bless those who can do economic history. But then as I began to really read and research and put down on paper, what I was finding is that you cannot, so this is the conceptual framework you're asking me, right? You cannot write a national or local economic history without factoring in children's labor and what kind of labor is valued specific to that geographical time and context. I would argue further that you cannot write an international economic history, a transnational economic, because really, if you think about it and you think about the Great Depression, you think about the interwar period, you think about the increase in legitimate commerce, et cetera, you can't understand that without factoring in children's economic importance to that history. So of course there are overlapping realms, but for me that's the most important to understand. And that's not to say that I can't also center individual experiences in whatever way I have them in the, you know, from the archive or oral interviews or whatnot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
All right, up next I have Solomon. You'll need to unmute yourself. There we go.
Here we go. We are not hearing you. Yes.
I would like to thank the presenter.
Yes.
For the wonderful, yeah, I would like to thank the presenter for the work well done. However, I have 3 questions.
Sure.
From your presentation, would I be right to say that the colonialists were implicitly allowing human pawning in order to boost the economy of the colony and the development of the motherland?
Could you repeat the second question, please?
Is it right to say that the British colonialists? Okay, so first, let me repeat it first. I said from your presentation, will I be right to say that the colonialists were implicit in allowing human pawning in order to boost the economy of the colony and the development of the motherland?
Absolutely, and they
Because
clearly
question.
state that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry
Is it
to.
right to say that the British would not let me pay for
I heard you. I did hear you. Thank you so much. That's an important question. Yes, they were not, and they were they were writing letters saying, if we stop pawning, they will no longer be able to pay taxes. So they understood the importance of the money that these families gained from pawning.
We might have
Then,
lost you a little bit, Solomon. Would you?
think in your intellectual analysis? Hello?
Yes, I'm listening.
Hello?
Do you think
Hello?
you can type the question? You're breaking
Good.
up. Can you
I said,
type
do
it?
you think in your intellectual? Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay.
So maybe we can let him type his question and I can come back.
Yeah, Solomon, why don't you go ahead and add your question to the chat, and I'll come back
Yes.
as soon as it's there. Tatiana, do you want to ask a question while we're waiting for that question to come in?
Okay, sorry about that. I have unmuted myself. Thank you, Robin, for writing truly excellent book. It's on my shelf at Rutgers.
Thank you.
I'm a professor there now. I missed you while you were there. Vanessa just told me that you were there together. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I thought that you had gone to the University of Toronto or something. So my question is very concrete, and it's about the paperwork. So I'm an economic historian too, and I deal a lot with legal sources, right? That's kind of like the bread and butter, that and property records. And I'm interested in the language that was used in the pawning agreement that enabled the pawner to transform that person from a pawn, from a free pawn, to an enslaved person that could be sold. And I'm thinking about this in the context of documents that I've been reading very closely, which are apprentice records that are thinly veiled accounts or documentation, where it really does seem like there's a transformation that happens in the contract, that a person goes from being a free indigenous woman to then becoming somebody who can be sold at market. So the language, and then also in a related question, what court system is the one that would uphold that legal status? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. What you are asking is tricky because there's only one space after 1901 where slavery remains legal. And that's in the trading houses, right, along the coast. But even then, you could say that there are pawns there are apprentices, and then there are previously enslaved that, you know, if they're old, elderly, they might be otherwise indigent. So there's all of these types of people that are housed in this. Because I'm mapping out a precursor of this one particular law that begins to allow us to shape the importance of the colonial economy and keeping some of these subordinate statuses working. I just offer that as kind of the preface. I don't look at much more. I mean, I look at some slaves in the houses, and I you know, the talk about, I don't want to be freed because if I'm freed, I have to give up all of my rights to things that I've acquired while I was here. But during the 1920s and 30s, pawning's legal, but it's a customary thing. The courts don't manage this.
Okay.
they can go to court and sue and say, I've paid off my debt and they're not giving me my son or something like that back, or my son or my daughter. But those aren't the kind of court cases that really pop up with regards to debt or money lending in that kind of way, because it's more informal. For instance, when I looked at how pawns were contracted, there was for some, a really formal ritual where a father, let's say it was the father and the man, the recipient of the young girl or the young boy, they would stand bare feet on the ground, right? And they would promise to uphold each of their ends of the bargain, but especially the recipient of the child. And if there is any failure to take care of that child, you know, you're basically telling the universe to curse you because you're barefoot on the ground. So my approach, or what I've learned, is more through anecdotal evidence with regards to these agreements, not legal paperwork. Now, the slippage between the two statuses is so difficult to, you know, in my mind, a money lender who took the child as a pawn, the moment it went to a third party,
It's
sale, enslaved, you know, or whatnot. That's how I envision it. But that's a great question. I wish I had those kind of documents.
Well, thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
All right. While you were answering, Tatiana, Solomon typed his question into the chat. So Dr. Solomon Ochepa Ojuma Abo asks, do you think that the colonialists should pay reparation to Nigeria for child pawning and eventual slavery to pay colonial taxes?
Oh man, that's a big question. Wow, I've never thought about this in the Nigerian context. Why not? Right? I mean, if and I'm not even trying to be flip about it, if we're thinking about reparations as this way to acknowledge harm, there were so many, and I mentioned this in the book, it is very hard to enumerate these children that were lost in pawn, and precisely, Tatiana, because we just don't have these records, right? So there might be a documentation issue, but I'll tell you what, people remember having to pawn, like the grandparents pawning or receiving, you know, one man told me, or during his interview, he said, one of my mothers was acquired because her family was poor and my dad didn't want to take her, but he had to, and he ended up having to marry her because the dad couldn't pay the loan back, right? So there were some instances where it was true help to take in a pawn child. But in other instances where they're selling the children off directly into slavery, knowing that the colonial entity was dependent, when I say openly dependent, they were documenting between themselves that they understood why pawning was important. I don't see why we would preclude something like that in terms of imperialism when we consider it for other situations that are different, but kind of similar. Thank you for that question. A whole essay could be written on that. Don't give me another project, please.
I was gonna say, Robin, we just heard that bio. You've got a lot of projects, but all right. Thank you so much for sticking with us, Solomon, and putting that in the chat. I have now Timmy Tope.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes.
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 Greetings to everyone. I want to firstly thank the presenter for the presentation. I think I joined the meeting quite late, but I mean, in spite of that, I was able to deduce some important analysis from our presentation. What I want to ask is, I wouldn't know if there's a way at which the presenter made use of or went through, Toyin Falola's slavery and pawnship? Because there is a need for us to be able to, concretely conceptualize these terms. And I'm saying this because there's a way at which, we can, end up not really understanding the economic basis of slavery and also, or mistake, the economic basis of slavery to that of pawnship. Because, for instance, in the Yoruba cosmological belief system, you have, Owe. Owe, is the traditional name of what has been translated to be pawnship. But within the context of the sociocultural belief system of the people also, there is a way at which Owe has, a communalistic tendency, so that it has, yes, it does have an economic basis of itself, but it is mostly geared towards the need to, to create that, what is, predicate and institutionalize, the belief of cosmology, communalism within the context of the society. So that when the colonial social forces, arrived, there was bound to be a distortion of this practice, and that is why you have a scenario where, pawnship now became more of an economic, expression of what was happening at that time in colonial, Lagos, in colonial Nigeria, and what have you. Because you now have a scenario where the cash economy itself, has made it compulsory for the people to be interested in nothing but capital. The search for capital in order to pay the taxes, as you have made mention of, and what have you. And there was bound to be a corruption of this tendency, so that it will be incorrect to say that, pawnship, can be understood as slavery within the context of how it has been, say, before colonialism, during the pre-colonial era, because it has more of what I've explained to be a communalistic tendency. Because again, we have seen scenarios and cases where those children, for an instance, they were taken, as away, as pawns, they were pawned. We've seen scenarios wherein they rose to prominence. We then compare that practice to slavery, because these are two different things. And I think it would be proper also to conceptualize slavery itself. You have different forms of slavery. You have chattel slavery, you have domestic slavery, have all of these tendencies, concretely for us to be able to understand. For instance, in colonial Lagos, you have Oshodi Takpa. Oshodi Takpa was taken, as, was a victim of pawnship, Oshodi Takpa, a victim of pawnship, but rose to prominence in colonial Lagos to such a extent that he became a war commander. Can we really compare that to, slavery? If we're comparing it to slavery, what form of slavery? Chattel slavery or domestic slavery? Thank you for your time.
No, thank you for your question. Absolutely, we have to make distinctions, right? I do not compare, in my book, I do not compare pawnship to chattel slavery specifically. What I say is that slaves in this region, and this is according to Lovejoy and others that have done so much work in this area, slaves were without particular rights, i.e. the right to be redeemed, while pawns did have a right to be redeemed. There is a certain amount of porosity between all of these different statuses, whether you're an apprentice, a pawn, a slave, a young girl who's been betrothed early, right? They are not exactly the same, absolutely not. But often there are economic and social factors that allow the slippage. What I will say about pawnship that may speak to one of your earlier comments is that pawnship was not just an economic arrangement. Pawnship was distinct and important for maintaining kinship systems, for supporting the elderly when the elderly needed a child to come into the home and help fetch water, or any one of these other household chores, or a mother who had several young children who may have needed an older girl to come and help. But the safety net, the importance of maintaining your kin in that kind of way began to break down during the colonial era. So I hope that in part answers your question.
Thanks so much. Katie, you're next on the queue.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, you talk a lot about the economic benefits that the colonists argued for keeping human pawnship, but was there any kind of benefit to the children and for continuing this form of economic welfare, or was it strictly for taxes and money benefits?
Well, that's a really good question. So there's a couple of things, or a couple of ways we can look at this. If a child was going to work for another individual, let's say agricultural reasons, we can't always look at all forms of child labor as the worst possible type of child labor. So children in that way could become industrious, right? They could learn a skill beyond agriculture too. They could, in that way, in that same space of being a pawn, they could apprentice to learn to be, whether blacksmith is tricky because sometimes you have to be born into the lineage, but any number of other crafts, right? Girls could be, learn to be more tradespeople in the markets. Often there might be a promise to educate children once they were received as pawns. And a lot of the people interviewed said, we've taken pawns in and we treat them just the same. They sleep in the kids' bedrooms. We pay school fees just, for them, just like we do our own children. But they always accused other people of treating them horribly and treating them like slaves and like second-class citizens. I found it really interesting, the distinction. But if we are to believe what they're saying about their own personal experience in receiving children, then yes, most likely they've been pawned into a more affluent family and they are receiving an education. They should be fed like the other children, etc. But I do believe that there are many times when children are not treated equitably. So the hope is that they are receiving some kind of positive training, education, or otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So next we have Natalie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Pierre. I'm an assistant professor at Howard University. Thank you so much for your overview of the book. I did an aggressive skim of the introduction, and I was really curious about the category of using children as a category of analysis. And if you could just walk us through what being a child means at the various points of the book. And my second question is, this is specifically for female children. So you mentioned that some children who were pawned at some point, they could be converted, the price of their pawning could be converted into a bride price. So I was just curious, in your research, were there any instances where children pawns were used sexually and parents brought up suits about their children being used sexually during their pawnship period? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your question. All these questions have been great. So I had to be very practical about the way that I began to write about children, and use both British norms of kind of assigning chronology as one way to identify a child. So whether it's up to the age of 14 or up to the age of 16. So, and especially because so many of the the British laws for the metropole were reenacted in Nigeria itself when they talked about who is a child. Generally, from the interviews that I have received, it's 17 is usually the cutoff. If we have a closely documented age, that's usually the cutoff. But legally, I stuck with the periodization and the age according to the British laws that were applied in Nigeria. But what also ends up happening when you are, when doing work on Nigeria, is that maturation has a lot to do with being a child. So you can have young men or even older men who might be 30, but if they're unmarried and they don't have children themselves, they are not considered an adult. So that gets a little bit tricky. And one thing that I do describe in the book is that there are so many men who don't have access to funds to pay the bride price that there is an influx of available young women and even girls who have not been betrothed or married. And this extra surplus of young women, they're the ones who are going to Lagos, where Abosede George then does her study on what's happening there with prostitution or whatnot. I mean, mainly, of course, it's hawking, but you look at the other activities that the girls are doing. So there are real implications when men cannot become men by virtue of not having access to bride price funds. And then, can you just repeat the second question again?
No problem. So the second question was about specifically female children who are pawned, who at some point they get converted into a wife. So their pawn fee was converted into a bride price. So my question is, with that sort of delicate slippage, did any parents ever come to court to challenge their daughters being used sexually before that sort of conversion?
I could not find, in direct relation to being a pawn, that kind of claim. What we know that it happened. I mean, it just had to have happened. Where you do find, and this is for another article that I'm writing about the 50s, what I am finding now is women who end up in these, ended up married in arrangements more because of an economic strategy. I won't necessarily say that they've actually been pawned, but they've decided to accept the parents need the bride price. They've decided to marry their daughter off. And even though the woman largely has a say, if your parents are saying, we need this exchange to happen, then most, a lot of young women agree to it. When the woman gets there, and if she's abused, which we do see in the court records, we do see, and then she tries to go home and she describes the abuse. She wants her parents to be able to return the bride price, right? Divorce or not, she wants the bride price returned so that eventually she can get married in time. I actually see the parents not wanting to return regardless of the abuse, and they send the girl back. So not necessarily sexual abuse, but the physical abuse, but it is centered around whether or not the parents can afford to give the money back. I don't doubt that there is some information out there about the sexual abuse part during the 20s and 30s, but I haven't found it. And I hope somebody will kind of look at that kind of circumstance on the ground.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions.
Do you have any more questions? We have time for maybe one or two more before we sign off for the evening.
Solomon says, I have one more.
Sorry. I have one question, Robin. Then let me just ask you the following. In terms of Nigeria, I don't know when you have been there for the last time. In the beginning of the book club, you mentioned you were then telling us a little bit about the different times that you went to do research, but to which extent these discussions between among Nigerians of different backgrounds and in which different communities this discussion that you bring in your book appear in the public sphere? Because what is interesting in the work that you do, of course, there are these several layers that come before this more recent period when these issues of either enslavement of children or also pawnship, but these practices come back from the period of slavery and continue during colonialism and are still somewhat present. I would like to know to which extent these debates about this kind of different labor regimes, they appear in the public sphere or not, because in different societies of West Africa, then when you are talking about other slave trades that are not the Atlantic slave trade or even internal slavery, usually these dimensions, they remain buried over under the past associated to the Atlantic slave trade. And I would like you to just discuss a little bit about these issues.
Yeah. So I gave a faculty lecture at the University of Calabar about my work. And if you don't mind me saying, all hell broke loose among the faculty. Part of the faculty was saying, absolutely not. We never sold our children. We never pawned our children. This did not exist. This is a fabrication of the colonial entity. And I was sitting there or standing there thinking, how do I get myself out of this, right? I mean, I've done my research. I mean, we can always re-examine what materials that we have and what interviews that we have, right? But I thought, I just don't think I got it that wrong. But then the other faculty were like literally yelling across the forum, saying that's a lie. You know, my great grandmother told me, and we had our own pawn, and he or she may as well have been a slave because we had them their entire lives. I mean, there are some individuals that absolutely will not acknowledge it. And I don't know, I mean, I could make my own personal assumptions, but I'll say this, I don't know if they truly believe that it did not exist, that either pawning or the slippage from a pawn to an enslaved person, or that the increased selling of children occurred during the 20s or 30s, or if it's just that, like you mentioned, you just don't talk about this in the public sphere. But there are other individuals that very much remember the instance of child pawning and the kind of slippages that could occur. And again, there must be some kind of, I'll use the word shame about it, because they always locate those instances of pawning and slavery, or pawning that slipped into slavery they relegate it to some other population, right? They'll say, well, you know, the Nike in northern Enugu, the Nike would say, we never sold our own children. But they were honest. They said, but we bought children for the farms, to work on the farms, right? Or Okigwe was a huge market center, right? And the traders there would engage in the kind of trading of children. But there were others, you know, especially from Aba and other places, that would say, absolutely, we did not engage in this kind of child trafficking. I appreciate that question, because I really, sometimes I forget about these instances where I get huge pushback. And just luckily for me, it's a debate among Nigerians. I just present what I have found. And I think really it's their responsibility to either come to terms with it or explain why there's such a difference in opinion.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. It would be important to see who are those who, in other places, it's perhaps possible to identify who are the groups that, because of the internal divisions, then the groups that in the past were, then whose ancestors, for example, led, then I'm talking here about the period of the Atlantic slave trade, who led slave raids and so on, and other groups that today they are inside the same country, but that during the period of the Atlantic slave trade, they were of different, let's say, ethnic groups, and who don't see their connection to this past in the same way. But it's very important that that you are doing this work.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your attendance, for your amazing questions. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to share my work.
Thank you so much, Robin.
This has been a wonderful session. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the fun's not over. There's still more of Slavery Archive Book Club to enjoy. I encourage you to visit our YouTube site where you can find all the past sessions. They're often useful in courses. And I invite you to join us next time. And Anna actually has our next book in hand. Anna, can you show the book again here also?
Yes, just for those of you, I have to put this because I have a background. Then I invite all of you to come next week, the same day, that is Wednesday, 5 p.m., to join us to discuss the book by Takara Brunson. And the book is titled Black Women, Citizenship, and the Making of Modern Cuba. Then please come. I have to move here for you to see it. And you'll be glad to continue the discussion. And meanwhile, please buy and assign and read Robin's book. This discussion, of course, will be on YouTube.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
so
get
much.
the book, teach the book, and share the book with others. Thank you so much for tonight, Robin. We really appreciate
Thank
you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you so much. And thank you all who came. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Bye-bye.